Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's slimiest nightmares, the medieval leech catcher. Think your job is bad? Imagine days spent ankle-deep in swamp muck, fishing for bloodsuckers that could kill you before they ever cured a soul. It's filthy, it's dangerous, and somehow it was considered medicine. So, light a candle, lock the doors, and thank modern science, because things are about to get gross. Before we wade into these treacherous waters together, take a moment to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying these deep dives into history's most miserable occupations. And please let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all gathered here, safe and warm, learning about people who spent their days knee-deep in medieval swamps, covered in blood-sucking parasites. Now, settle in, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's ease into tonight's tale of survival, suffering, and the peculiar human ability to find a way to make a living doing absolutely anything, no matter how horrifying. You've probably heard of bloodletting, that charming medieval medical practice where physicians would drain patients' blood to cure everything from headaches to heartbreak. What you might not know is that this wasn't just some occasional procedure performed with a quick knife cut. No, medieval medicine had turned bloodletting into an art form, and the star performers in this gory theatre weren't the doctors themselves, but rather small, slimy creatures that could latch onto human skin and drain blood with the precision of tiny organic syringes. These were medicinal leeches, and they were in constant, desperate demand throughout the medieval world. Every physician needed them, every monastery infirmary required a steady supply, and every noble household kept them on hand for those inevitable moments when someone's humours needed balancing. The problem was, leeches don't exactly grow on trees. They live in the most unpleasant places imaginable. Stagnant swamps, fetid marshes, and boggy wetlands that medieval people quite reasonably believed were inhabited by demons, evil spirits, and various forms of pestilence. This is where you come in. You're not a physician, not a learned monk, not even a respectable peasant farmer. You're something much lower on the social ladder, something that exists in the shadowy margins of medieval society. You're a leech catcher, and your job is to venture into these cursed wetlands day after day and emerge with buckets full of bloodthirsty parasites that will keep the medical establishment running. Think your job is stressful? Try spending your entire working life wading through disease-infested swamps, letting dozens of leeches attach themselves to your legs, and then carefully removing them one by one while they're still gorged with your own blood. Imagine doing this in all weather, in all seasons, with no protective equipment, no health insurance, and no guarantee that you'll make it home alive each evening. The medieval world was not kind to anyone, but it was particularly cruel to those at the very bottom of society's hierarchy. And if you were a leech catcher, you weren't just at the bottom, you were somewhere beneath the bottom, in a category of human existence that most people preferred not to think about. You were essential, absolutely vital to the functioning of medieval medicine, but you were also invisible, disposable, and utterly expendable. Your story begins not with choice, but with circumstance. Nobody grows up dreaming of becoming a leech catcher. This isn't a profession you stumble into after a career fair or discover through a helpful guidance counselor. This is a job you inherit, like a family curse passed down through generations of people who had no other options, no other skills, and no other way to survive in a world that had already decided your fate before you took your first breath. Born into the bog. You didn't choose this life. Choice. You were born into a family of leech catchers, which means you were born into a legacy of desperation, a bloodline of people who had been wading through swamps for so many generations that your ancestors probably had webbed feet and gills. Your family doesn't own land. They don't have a trade that can be practiced indoors. They don't have connections to the local lord or relationships with prosperous merchants. What they have is an intimate knowledge of every bog, marsh, and stagnant pond within a day's walk of the village, and the hard-earned expertise to extract leeches from these places without dying in the process. This knowledge, passed down like a family heirloom made of mud and misery, is your inheritance. Your earliest memories aren't of toys or games or bedtime stories. They're of the smell, that distinctive, overwhelming aroma that clings to your family like a second skin. The scent of stagnant water mixed with rotting vegetation, punctuated by the metallic tang of blood and the earthy musk of creatures that spend their lives in places where the sun never quite reaches. This smell permeates everything in your world. Your clothes, your hair, your food, your dreams. It's the smell of survival, and it's the smell of your future. Your parents, if you can call them that, are more like fellow survivors than nurturing caregivers. They love you in their own exhausted way, but love in your family is measured in practical terms. Love is teaching you which plants indicate good leech habitat. Love is showing you how to move through a marsh without getting stuck in the mud. Love is explaining which types of water are likely to kill you quickly versus slowly. Affection is a luxury they can't afford, but survival skills are gifts they give freely because they know that without them, you won't live to see your 15th birthday. Your mother, assuming she survived your birth and the various diseases that regularly sweep through the poorest parts of the village, is a woman who looks decades older than her actual age. Her hands are permanently stained with mud and blood, her back is bent from years of crouching in shallow water, and her eyes have the hollow look of someone who has seen too much suffering and expects to see more. She moves with the careful, deliberate pace of someone whose body has been broken and rebuilt so many times that every step is a negotiation with pain. She teaches you the basics of the trade before you can properly walk. How to identify the subtle differences between water that might contain leeches and water that will definitely contain things much worse than leeches. How to read the surface of a pond like other children read picture books, looking for the tiny ripples and disturbances that indicate life below. How to distinguish between the good kind of mud that cushions your feet and the bad kind that will swallow you whole if you're not careful. Your father, if he's still alive and hasn't succumbed to one of the many occupational hazards of leech catching, is a man who has been shaped by his environment in the most literal sense. His legs are a roadmap of scars from countless leech bites, infections, and encounters with the sharp, hidden objects that lurk beneath the surface of medieval swamps. His lungs make a wet, rattling sound when he breathes, the result of years of inhaling the noxious vapours that rise from stagnant water. His hands shake slightly, not from age, but from the constant low-level fever that comes from repeated exposure to the diseases that breed in wetland environments. He doesn't talk much, partly because conversation is a luxury when you're focused on survival, and partly because he's learned that most of what he has to say isn't particularly encouraging. When he does speak, it's usually to share some hard-won piece of wisdom about the trade. How to tell when a leech has had enough blood and will detach easily versus when it's still feeding and will tear your skin if you try to remove it too quickly. How to recognize the early signs of marsh fever and what to do about it, which is mostly nothing, but at least you'll know what's killing you. Your siblings, if any of them have survived infancy, are your closest companions and your primary competition. In a family where resources are measured in handfuls of grain and sips of clean water, every mouth to feed is both a blessing and a burden. You learn early that cooperation is essential for survival, but so is the ability to look out for yourself when cooperation isn't enough. The village where you live, if it can be called a village, is really more of a collection of hovels clustered around the edges of the wetlands that provide your livelihood. It's not the kind of place that appears on maps or attracts visitors. It's the kind of place that exists because someone has to live near the swamps, and the people who live near the swamps are the people who have nowhere else to go. The other villagers tolerate your family's presence because they need the leeches you provide, but they don't welcome you into their homes or invite you to their celebrations. Your house, such as it is built on stilts to keep it above the water level during the rainy season, which in your part of the world seems to last approximately 11 months out of every 12. The walls are made of whatever materials your family could scavenge or steal. Bits of wood, patches of thatch, stones pulled from the marsh bottom during particularly desperate times. The roof leaks constantly, but this is actually a blessing because it helps wash away some of the smell that would otherwise accumulate to unbearable levels. Inside, there's barely enough room for your family to lie down at the same time. Privacy is a concept that doesn't exist in your world. You sleep in a pile with your siblings, sharing body heat and whatever blankets your family has managed to acquire over the years. These blankets, like everything else you own, smell permanently of swamp water and have the texture of something that has been wet and dried so many times that the original material is more of a suggestion than a reality. Your diet consists primarily of whatever your family can catch, gather, or trade for in the village. Fish from the cleaner parts of the marsh, when you can catch them. Roots and plants that grow in wet soil, when you can identify them correctly and when they haven't been contaminated by the various forms of pollution that characterize your environment. Bread, when your family has managed to trade enough leeches to afford it, which is not often. Water is a constant concern. You're surrounded by water, but most of it is unfit for drinking. The marsh water is contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and various forms of organic decay that will make you violently ill if you consume them. The clean water has to be carried from a well in the village centre, assuming the well hasn't been contaminated by runoff from the surrounding marshes, which it frequently is. Education in the formal sense is not something that happens in your family. You don't learn to read or write, partly because there's no one to teach you, and partly because literacy is a skill that has no practical application in your daily life. What you do learn is far more immediately useful. How to navigate by the position of the sun and the patterns of the stars. How to predict weather changes by the behavior of insects and birds. How to treat wounds and infections with whatever plants and materials are available in your environment. Your childhood games, such as they are, revolve around the skills you'll need as an adult. You play hide and seek in the marsh grass, learning to move silently and remain motionless for long periods. You have contests to see who can hold their breath the longest underwater, building the lung capacity you'll need for diving to collect leeches from deeper pools. You practice identifying different types of leeches by touch alone, developing the sensitivity you'll need to work in murky water where visibility is limited. By the time you're 5 years old, you're already accompanying your parents on their daily expeditions into the swamps. At first, you're just an observer, learning to recognize the signs and patterns that indicate good hunting grounds. You learn to read the landscape like a book, understanding that certain types of vegetation indicate certain water conditions, that particular bird calls suggest the presence of the small fish that leeches feed on, that specific smells warn of dangerous gases or contaminated water. The transition from childhood observer to active participant in the family business happens around your 8th birthday, assuming you've managed to keep track of such things in a world where calendars are luxuries and birthdays are rarely celebrated. This isn't a gentle introduction to the working world. There's no gradual increase in responsibility, no training wheels, no safety net. One morning you wake up, and your father looks at you with the same expression he might use to evaluate a new tool, calculating, practical, and slightly disappointed that you're not already better at this. Your formal apprenticeship begins with what your family optimistically calls conditioning, but which feels more like a systematic program designed to break down your natural human instincts and rebuild you as something better suited to life in a swamp. The first lesson is simple. You're going to spend the next several hours standing waist-deep in cold, murky water while leeches attach themselves to your legs. Your job is to remain perfectly still, to resist every natural impulse to flee or fight, and to learn to think of these creatures not as parasites but as valuable commodities that happen to be feeding on your blood. The water in early spring, when your training begins, is cold enough to make your bones ache within minutes. It's the kind of cold that seeps through your skin and settles into your core, making your teeth chatter and your muscles cramp. But you're not allowed to move, not allowed to warm yourself, not allowed to do anything that might disturb the leeches or reduce their effectiveness as blood-drawing tools. You stand there, shivering and miserable, while your father explains the finer points of leech behaviour in the same tone other parents might use to discuss the weather. The first time a leech attaches itself to your leg, every instinct you possess screams at you to rip it off immediately. The sensation is unlike anything you've experienced, a sharp pinch followed by a strange pulling feeling as the creature begins to feed. Your skin crawls, your stomach lurches, and your brain floods with panic signals that you're being eaten alive by something that shouldn't exist. But your father's hand on your shoulder keeps you in place, and his voice, calm and matter-of-fact, explains that this is normal, this is necessary, and this is what you'll be feeling for the rest of your working life. Learning to identify different types of leeches becomes your primary educational focus. Not all leeches are suitable for medical use, and the ability to distinguish between valuable specimens and worthless ones is the difference between eating regularly and starving slowly. The medicinal leeches, the ones that physicians actually want, are larger, darker, and more aggressive than their smaller cousins. They attach more quickly, feed more efficiently, and detach more cleanly when they're finished. The inferior leeches, the ones that are too small or too sluggish or too likely to leave infected wounds, are worse than useless because they take up space and time that could be devoted to collecting the valuable ones. You learn to identify good leeches by touch, since much of your work will be done in water too murky to see through. The valuable ones feel different when they attach, firmer, more purposeful, more committed to the task of draining your blood. The worthless ones feel tentative, uncertain, like they're not quite sure what they're supposed to be doing. You learn to distinguish between them within seconds of contact, developing a sensitivity that borders on the supernatural. Your training also includes lessons in leech psychology, if such a thing can be said to exist. Leeches, it turns out, are surprisingly particular about their feeding conditions. They prefer certain water temperatures, certain levels of salinity, certain types of movement from their hosts. A leech that's comfortable and confident will feed quickly and efficiently, then detach cleanly when it's finished. A leech that's stressed or uncomfortable will feed slowly, irregularly, and may refuse to detach at all, requiring painful manual removal that often results in torn skin and infected wounds. Learning to manage your own blood loss becomes a crucial skill. A productive day of leech catching might involve dozens of leeches feeding on your legs, arms, and torso, each one taking approximately 20 minutes to fill itself with your blood. The cumulative effect of this blood loss is significant. Dizziness, weakness, nausea, and a constant feeling of exhaustion that never quite goes away. You learn to recognize the early signs of dangerous blood loss and to pace yourself accordingly, taking breaks when necessary and eating whatever iron-rich foods your family can afford. The physical conditioning required for leech catching extends far beyond simply tolerating blood loss. You need to develop the stamina to spend entire days wading through difficult terrain, the balance to move safely across unstable surfaces, and the strength to carry heavy loads of water and leeches back to your base camp. Your legs need to become strong enough to push through thick mud and flexible enough to navigate around underwater obstacles. Your arms need to develop the endurance to hold buckets and containers for hours at a time without cramping or dropping them. Your feet, in particular, undergo a dramatic transformation during your apprentice years. The soft, tender skin of childhood is gradually replaced by thick, leathery calluses that can withstand sharp stones, broken glass, and the various metal objects that seem to accumulate in the bottom of every medieval marsh. You learn to walk barefoot across surfaces that would cripple someone with normal feet, developing a sensitivity that allows you to detect dangerous objects before they can cause serious injury. Weather becomes your constant adversary and occasional ally. Rain makes the work more difficult by raising water levels and reducing visibility, but it also brings fresh water into the marshes and can improve leech activity. Wind can make it nearly impossible to work in deeper water, but it also helps disperse the noxious gases that accumulate in stagnant areas. Snow and ice shut down leech catching entirely, but they also provide opportunities to repair equipment and plan for the coming season. You learn to read weather patterns with the skill of a professional meteorologist, understanding that your survival depends on your ability to predict changes in conditions. A sudden storm can trap you in the middle of a marsh with no shelter and no way to reach safety. An unexpected freeze can leave you stranded on ice too thin to support your weight but too thick to break through. A heat wave can make the water too warm for leeches to feed properly, wasting days of effort and leaving you with nothing to show for your work. The tools of your trade are simple but essential. Buckets and containers for transporting leeches, made from whatever materials your family can acquire or fashion. Probing sticks for testing the depth and stability of the marsh bottom before committing your full weight to it. Knives for cutting through vegetation and removing leeches that refuse to detach naturally. Bandages and rags for treating the inevitable cuts, scrapes, and infected wounds that come with the job. You learn to maintain and repair these tools with the same care that a knight might lavish on his sword and armor. A broken bucket means lost leeches and lost income. A dull knife means more difficult and dangerous leech removal. A torn bandage means infected wounds that could kill you if they're not properly treated. Everything you own has to be functional, reliable, and ready for immediate use, because there are no backup tools and no way to replace equipment that breaks at a critical moment. Your relationship with your mentor, usually your father or another family member, is complex and often strained. They're trying to teach you skills that will keep you alive, but they're also competing with you for the same limited resources. Every leech you catch is one less leech available for them. Every good feeding spot you discover is one that they might not be able to use. The knowledge they share with you is valuable, but it's also the only advantage they have in a profession where experience and expertise are the only things that separate survival from starvation. By the end of your apprentice years, usually around age 12 or 13, you've been transformed from a normal human child into something specifically adapted for life in the marshes. Your body has been conditioned to tolerate blood loss, cold water, and physical discomfort. Your mind has been trained to remain calm in dangerous situations and to make quick decisions based on limited information. Your senses have been sharpened to detect subtle changes in your environment that might indicate opportunity or danger. By your 15th year, if you've managed to survive the apprentice period without drowning, dying of infection, or simply giving up and walking into the forest to become someone else's problem, your body has undergone a transformation that would be remarkable if it weren't so horrifying. You no longer look like a normal human being. You look like something that was designed by committee, with each committee member having a different and deeply disturbing idea about what a human should be capable of enduring. Your skin, once soft and pink like any other child's, has taken on the pale, slightly translucent quality of something that spends too much time underwater. It's not quite the healthy tan of someone who works outdoors, and it's not quite the pallor of someone who never sees sunlight. It's something in between, something that suggests your body has given up trying to maintain normal human coloration and has settled for a shade that might charitably be described as swamp adjacent. The texture of your skin has changed as well. Years of constant exposure to stagnant water, leech bites, and various forms of marsh-dwelling bacteria have left it thick and leathery in some places, thin and scarred in others. Your legs in particular look like a road map of your professional history. Every leech bite has left its mark, small, circular scars that never quite fade, larger wounds from leeches that had to be removed forcibly, and the occasional dramatic gash from encounters with the sharp objects that lurk beneath the surface of every medieval swamp. Your feet have become something that barely qualifies as human anatomy. The soles are so thick and calloused that you can walk across broken glass without feeling it, which is fortunate because medieval marshes are full of broken pottery, discarded metal, and other debris that would cripple someone with normal feet. Your toes have developed a prehensile quality that allows you to grip slippery surfaces and feel for hidden obstacles underwater. Your toenails, what's left of them, are thick and yellowed and often partially missing from encounters with rocks, roots, and the occasional snapping turtle. Your hands tell their own story of adaptation and abuse. The palms are covered with calluses so thick they feel like leather gloves that you can never take off. Your fingers have developed an unusual sensitivity that allows you to identify different types of leeches by touch alone, even in complete darkness. This sensitivity comes at a cost. Your hands are constantly cold, constantly slightly numb, and prone to sudden, painful cramps that can strike at the worst possible moments. The scars on your hands and arms form a complex pattern that speaks to the various hazards of your profession. Thin, straight lines from knife cuts during leech removal, jagged tears from encounters with submerged branches and metal objects, circular marks from particularly aggressive leeches that refuse to detach cleanly. Larger, more irregular scars from infections that had to be drained with whatever sharp objects were available. Each scar has a story, and collectively they tell the story of a body that has been used as a tool for so long that it's forgotten how to be anything else. Your posture has adapted to the requirements of your work in ways that would fascinate a physician if any physician were interested in studying the long-term effects of professional leech catching, which they're not. Your back has developed a permanent slight hunch from years of bending over to examine the marsh bottom and collect leeches from shallow water. Your shoulders are perpetually rolled forward from carrying heavy buckets and containers. Your neck has a forward thrust that comes from constantly looking down into murky water, searching for signs of leech activity. Your legs have become disproportionately strong compared to the rest of your body, developed through years of pushing through thick mud and maintaining balance on unstable surfaces. But this strength comes with a price. Your knees are constantly sore from the stress of working in cold water. Your ankles are prone to sudden weakness that can send you tumbling into the marsh at the worst possible moment. And your hips ache with a deep, persistent pain that never quite goes away. The most dramatic change, however, is in your blood. Years of regular blood loss have left you in a state of chronic, low-level anemia that affects every aspect of your physical and mental functioning. You're constantly tired, constantly slightly dizzy, constantly operating at about 70% of normal human capacity. Your heart has to work harder to pump what blood you have left, which means it's constantly racing even when you're at rest. Your breathing is shallow and rapid as your body tries to extract as much oxygen as possible from each breath. This chronic blood loss has also affected your immune system in complex ways. On one hand, you're constantly exposed to new diseases and infections from the marsh environment, which means your body is always fighting something. On the other hand, the stress of constant blood loss has weakened your overall resistance, making you more susceptible to serious illness when it strikes. You exist in a delicate balance between adaptation and collapse, never quite healthy, but never quite sick enough to stop working. Your digestive system has adapted to a diet that would horrify anyone with normal food standards. You can eat things that would make other people violently ill, partially spoiled fish, questionable plants, bread that's more mold than grain. Your stomach has developed the ability to extract nutrition from almost anything organic, which is fortunate because your food options are severely limited. Unfortunately, this adaptation comes with its own problems: chronic stomach pain, irregular digestion, and a constant low-level nausea that you've learned to ignore. Sleep, when you can get it, is rarely restful. Your body has become so accustomed to the stress and discomfort of your working environment that it has trouble relaxing even when you're safe and dry. You sleep lightly, waking at the slightest sound, always ready to respond to danger. Your dreams are filled with images of marshes, leeches, and the various disasters that could befall you during your working day. You often wake up more tired than when you went to sleep, as if your mind has been working all night to process the stress and trauma of your daily existence. Perhaps most disturbing is the way your body has learned to anticipate and prepare for the daily trauma of leech attachment. Your blood vessels have become more responsive, dilating more quickly when leeches attach and constricting more effectively when they detach. Your pain receptors have been partially numbed, allowing you to tolerate the discomfort of multiple leech bites without losing consciousness. Your body has essentially rewired itself to make the process of being fed upon by parasites as efficient and painless as possible. The psychological effects of these physical changes are profound. You no longer think of your body as something that belongs to you. It's become a tool, a piece of equipment that you use to extract leeches from marshes. You evaluate its condition the same way you might evaluate a bucket or a knife. Is it still functional? Does it need repair? How much longer can you expect it to last before it breaks down completely? Your working day begins before dawn, not because you're particularly motivated or because you enjoy watching the sunrise, but because the early morning hours offer the best conditions for leech catching. The water is cooler, which makes the leeches more active. The light is dim, which means you're less likely to be spotted by the various predators that share your working environment. Most importantly, you have the entire day ahead of you to work before exhaustion and blood loss force you to stop. You wake up in the pre-dawn darkness, feeling like you've been beaten with sticks, which in a sense you have. Your body never fully recovers from the previous day's work before it's time to begin again. Your joints ache, your muscles are stiff, and your head throbs with the dull pain that comes from chronic blood loss and dehydration. But you get up anyway, because staying in bed means not eating, and not eating means dying. And dying is generally considered the least attractive of your available options. Your breakfast, if it can be called that, consists of whatever food your family managed to acquire the previous day and whatever clean water you can find. The food is usually some combination of coarse bread, questionable fish, and plants that grow in or near the marshes. The bread is often mouldy, the fish is often spoiled, and the plants are often bitter and difficult to digest, but you eat them anyway because you need the energy and because complaining about food quality is a luxury you can't afford. The water situation is more complicated. You're surrounded by water, but most of it is unfit for drinking. The marsh water is contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and various forms of organic decay that will make you violently ill if you consume them. The clean water has to be carried from distant sources, which means it's precious and has to be rationed carefully. You drink just enough to keep yourself functional, saving the rest for the more critical task of keeping your captured leeches alive during transport. Getting dressed for work is a simple process because you don't really have work clothes in the conventional sense. You have one set of garments that you wear every day, a rough tunic that was probably brown at some point but has faded to an indeterminate colour that might charitably be described as mud adjacent, and a pair of leggings that are more whole than fabric but still provide some protection against the sharper objects that lurk in the marsh bottom. You don't wear shoes because shoes would be destroyed within hours by the harsh conditions of your working environment, and besides, your feet have become so tough and calloused that they provide better protection than any footwear you could afford. The walk to your working area takes anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, depending on how far you have to travel to find productive leech habitats. You carry your equipment with you, buckets for transporting leeches, containers for storing them temporarily, probing sticks for testing the marsh bottom, knives for removing stubborn leeches, and bandages for treating the inevitable injuries. The weight of this equipment, combined with your weakened physical condition, means that the walk to work is often as exhausting as the work itself. The marshes in the early morning are both beautiful and terrifying. The mist rises from the water in ghostly tendrils, creating an otherworldly landscape that seems to exist outside of normal time and space. The silence is broken only by the occasional splash of a fish jumping, the rustle of marsh grass in the wind, and the distant calls of birds that you rarely see but always hear. It's the kind of place that would inspire poets and artists if poets and artists were foolish enough to venture into disease-infested swampland at dawn. But you're not here for the scenery. You're here to work, and work begins with the careful process of selecting your first location. Not all parts of the marsh are equally productive. Leeches prefer certain water temperatures, certain depths, certain types of vegetation. They're more active in some areas than others, more numerous in some seasons than others. Learning to read these subtle signs and select the most promising locations is one of the most important skills in your profession. Once you've selected a location, the actual process of leech catching begins. You wade into the water slowly, carefully, testing each step to make sure the bottom is stable and won't suddenly give way beneath your weight. The water is cold, shockingly cold, even in summer. It seeps through your clothes and against your skin with the kind of penetrating chill that makes your bones ache and your muscles cramp. But you ignore the discomfort and continue deeper into the marsh until you're standing waist deep in murky water that smells like death and decay. Now comes the waiting. Leech catching is not an active process like fishing or hunting. It's a passive process that requires patience, stillness, and the ability to tolerate discomfort for extended periods. You stand motionless in the water, allowing your body heat and the scent of your blood to attract leeches from the surrounding area. This can take anywhere from a few minutes to several hours, depending on the local leech population and environmental conditions. The first sign that leeches are approaching is usually a subtle change in the water around your legs. You might feel a slight current or disturbance that indicates movement below the surface. Then comes the first contact. A gentle brush against your skin that could be a piece of floating vegetation or could be a leech investigating whether you're suitable prey. You have to remain perfectly still during this initial contact, resisting every natural instinct to move or react, because any sudden movement will frighten the leeches away. When a leech finally attaches itself to your leg, the sensation is unmistakable. There's a sharp pinch as its teeth penetrate your skin, followed by a strange pulling sensation as it begins to feed. Your first instinct is always to reach down and rip it off immediately, but you've learned to suppress this impulse. A leech that's disturbed while feeding will often tear your skin when it's removed, leaving a wound that's more serious than the original bite and more likely to become infected. Instead, you wait 20 minutes on average for each leech to fill itself with your blood and detach naturally. 20 minutes of standing perfectly still while something feeds on your body. 20 minutes of feeling your blood being slowly drained away. 20 minutes of fighting every natural human instinct that tells you to flee or fight. During this time, you might have several leeches attached simultaneously, each one taking its share of your blood, each one requiring the same patience and stillness. While you wait for the leeches to finish feeding, you scan the water around you for signs of additional activity. Leeches often travel in groups, and a location that produces one good specimen is likely to produce others. You also watch for signs of danger, changes in water level that might indicate flooding, unusual animal activity that might suggest the presence of predators, or changes in water color or smell that might indicate contamination. When a leech finally detaches, you have to move quickly but carefully to capture it before it can escape back into the marsh. This requires a delicate balance of speed and precision because leeches are surprisingly fast swimmers when they're motivated to escape. You use your hands to guide the leech into one of your containers, being careful not to damage it in the process. A damaged leech is worthless, and a dead leech is worse than worthless because it will contaminate the other leeches in your container. The process of leech removal is more complex when the creatures refuse to detach naturally. Some leeches, particularly the larger and more aggressive specimens, will continue feeding well beyond the normal 20-minute period. Others will attach so firmly that they seem determined to remain permanently connected to your body. In these cases, you have to remove them manually, using your knife to carefully cut them away from your skin without damaging either the leech or yourself. Manual leech removal is one of the most dangerous aspects of your job. The knife has to be sharp enough to cut through the leech's attachment mechanism, but not so sharp that it cuts too deeply into your own flesh. The angle has to be precise enough to separate the leech cleanly, but not so aggressive that it kills the creature. Your hands have to be steady enough to perform delicate surgery while standing waist-deep in cold water, often while other leeches are still attached to other parts of your body. The wounds left by leech bites are small but numerous, and they have a tendency to bleed for longer than normal cuts because leeches inject an anticoagulant that prevents blood clotting. By the end of a productive day, your legs and arms are covered with dozens of small, bleeding wounds that make you look like you've been attacked by a swarm of tiny vampires, which in a sense you have. These wounds have to be cleaned and bandaged as soon as possible to prevent infection, but cleaning them properly requires clean water, which is often in short supply. The physical toll of a day's work accumulates gradually but relentlessly. The cold water saps your body heat and energy. The blood loss leaves you weak and dizzy. The constant standing in one position causes muscle cramps and joint pain. The stress of remaining alert for danger while tolerating discomfort exhausts your mental resources. By midday, you're operating at a fraction of your normal capacity, but you continue working because stopping means losing income, and losing income means not eating. This is your daily routine, repeated with minor variations every day that weather and health permit. There are no weekends, no holidays, no vacation days. There is only work, rest, and the constant struggle to survive in a profession that demands everything you have to give and offers very little in return. The swamp environment. The marshes where you spend your working life are not the peaceful pastoral wetlands that modern nature documentaries might lead you to believe. These are medieval swamps, places that exist at the intersection of land and water, life and death, civilization and wilderness. They are environments so hostile to human life that most people avoid them entirely, and those who don't avoid them often don't survive them. You, unfortunately, have no choice but to make these places your second home, your office, your daily destination for survival. Medieval people understood something about swamps that modern people have largely forgotten. They are genuinely dangerous places, filled with threats both visible and invisible, natural and supernatural. The medieval mind didn't distinguish clearly between physical dangers and spiritual ones, and in the context of a disease-infested marsh where death lurks beneath every surface, this lack of distinction makes perfect sense. Whether you're killed by a bacterial infection or a malevolent spirit is largely academic when you're dead either way. The water itself is your primary enemy and your essential tool, a substance that you depend on for your livelihood, but that is constantly trying to kill you in a dozen different ways. Marsh water is not like the clean streams and rivers that supply drinking water to more fortunate communities. It's a complex ecosystem of bacteria, parasites, viruses, and other microscopic organisms that view your body as either a food source or a convenient place to reproduce. Every time you wade into the water, you're exposing yourself to diseases that have names you've never heard and symptoms you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. The most immediate danger is what medieval people called marsh fever, a catch-all term for the various illnesses that seem to arise spontaneously from wetland environments. Modern medicine would recognize these as mosquito-borne diseases like malaria, but medieval people understood only that certain places made people sick in predictable ways. The symptoms are familiar to anyone who works in the marshes: recurring fevers, chills, weakness, and a general feeling of being slowly poisoned from the inside out. Mosquitoes are a constant presence in your working environment, clouds of them that rise from the water like living smoke. They're not just annoying, they're vectors for diseases that can kill you slowly and painfully. You've learned to work through the constant buzzing, biting, and blood-sucking. But you've never learned to ignore the knowledge that each bite might be the one that introduces something fatal into your bloodstream. The irony is not lost on you that you make your living from blood-sucking creatures while being constantly attacked by other blood-sucking creatures. The water temperature varies dramatically with the seasons, and each variation brings its own set of challenges. In winter, the water is cold enough to cause hypothermia within hours. Your body heat drains away through your skin. Your muscles become stiff and unresponsive, and your thinking becomes slow and confused. You've learned to recognize the early signs of dangerous cold exposure, but you've also learned that recognizing the signs and being able to do something about them are two different things. In summer, the water becomes warm enough to accelerate bacterial growth and decomposition, creating a soup of organic matter that smells like death and feels like swimming in liquid decay. The warm water also increases the activity of various parasites and makes infections more likely to develop and spread. You've learned to prefer the cold water of winter despite the discomfort, because at least it's less likely to give you diseases that will kill you slowly. The marsh bottom is a treacherous landscape of hidden dangers that you navigate by feel rather than sight. Beneath the murky water lie sharp stones, broken pottery, discarded metal objects, and the occasional human or animal bone. Medieval people used marshes as dumping grounds for anything they didn't want, which means you're constantly stepping on or around the detritus of human civilization. Your feet have become tough enough to handle most of these hazards, but there's always the possibility of encountering something sharp enough or large enough to cause serious injury. Mud is both your ally and your enemy. The right kind of mud provides stable footing and indicates good leech habitat. The wrong kind of mud can trap you, sometimes permanently. You've learned to read the subtle differences in mud consistency, colour and smell that indicate whether it's safe to step on or whether it will swallow you up to your waist or deeper. Getting stuck in marsh mud is not just inconvenient, it can be fatal if you can't free yourself before the tide comes in or your body temperature drops too low. The vegetation in the marshes is as dangerous as it is useful. Some plants indicate good water quality and productive leech habitats. Others indicate contamination, disease, or other hazards. Some plants are edible and can supplement your meager diet. Others are poisonous and can kill you if you mistake them for food. You've learned to identify dozens of different plant species by sight, smell, and touch, but you've also learned that plants can change their characteristics based on soil conditions, water quality, and seasonal variations. Wildlife in the marshes ranges from merely annoying to actively hostile. Rats and other rodents carry diseases and compete with you for food sources. Snakes, some of them venomous, lurk in the vegetation and underwater. Birds, while generally harmless, can indicate the presence of predators or changes in environmental conditions. Larger animals like wild boar occasionally wander into the marshes, and an encounter with a frightened or aggressive boar in waist-deep water is not something you want to experience. The most dangerous wildlife, however, are the creatures you can't see. Parasitic worms that can enter your body through cuts in your skin. Bacteria that can cause infections, fever, and death. Viruses that can attack your nervous system or internal organs. These microscopic predators are everywhere in the marsh environment, and they're constantly looking for opportunities to colonize your body. You've developed some immunity to the most common ones through repeated exposure, but there are always new strains, new variations, new threats that your immune system hasn't encountered before. Weather in the marshes is amplified and intensified by the water and vegetation. Rain doesn't just fall, it creates instant flooding that can trap you in areas that were safe moments before. Wind doesn't just blow, it creates waves and currents that can knock you off your feet or push you into deeper water. Fog doesn't just reduce visibility, it can become so thick that you lose all sense of direction and wander in circles until you collapse from exhaustion or stumble into something that kills you. Lightning is particularly dangerous in the marshes because water conducts electricity and you're often the tallest object in a flat landscape. You've learned to recognize the signs of approaching thunderstorms and to seek shelter when possible. But shelter in a marsh environment is often inadequate or non-existent. Sometimes your only option is to lie flat in the water and hope that the lightning strikes something else, which is not a particularly comforting survival strategy. The seasonal cycle brings predictable but unavoidable challenges. Spring flooding can make familiar areas unrecognizable and dangerous. Summer heat can create toxic algae blooms that poison the water and kill the leeches you depend on for income. Autumn storms can destroy your equipment and force you to start over with nothing. Winter ice can make the marshes completely inaccessible, cutting off your income for months at a time. Perhaps the most insidious danger of the marsh environment is the way it affects your mind. The constant stress of working in a hostile environment, the social isolation of a profession that keeps you away from normal human contact, and the physical effects of chronic illness and malnutrition all combine to create a psychological burden that can be as dangerous as any physical threat. You've seen other leech catchers simply give up, walking into the deepest part of the marsh and never coming back out. The marshes also have a way of distorting your perception of time and space. The flat, featureless landscape makes it easy to become disoriented and lost. The repetitive nature of the work can create a trance-like state where hours pass without your awareness. The constant background noise of water, wind, and wildlife can mask the sounds of approaching danger until it's too late to react. You've learned to maintain constant vigilance, but vigilance is exhausting, and exhaustion leads to mistakes, and mistakes in the marshes are often fatal. Despite all these dangers, or perhaps because of them, the marshes have become your home in a way that your actual home never could be. You know every pool, every channel, every patch of vegetation in your working territory. You understand the rhythms and cycles of this environment better than you understand the rhythms and cycles of human society. You've adapted to this place so completely that you're no longer quite suited for anywhere else. The marshes have claimed you as surely as they've claimed the leeches you harvest from them. And like the leeches, you've found a way to survive in a place that seems designed to kill everything that enters it. Your place in society, in the grand hierarchy of medieval society, where everyone from kings to peasants has a clearly defined place and purpose, you occupy a position so low that it barely registers on the social scale. You're not quite a serf, because serfs at least work land that belongs to someone important. You're not quite a craftsman, because craftsmen create things that people want, rather than harvesting things that people need, but prefer not to think about. You're not quite a merchant, because merchants deal in goods that don't require them to be personally fed upon by the merchandise. You exist in a social category that might best be described as necessary but invisible, like the people who empty chamber pots or dispose of dead animals. Everyone knows that someone has to do these jobs, but no one wants to acknowledge the people who actually do them. You provide an essential service that keeps the medical establishment functioning, but you do it in a way that allows everyone else to maintain the comfortable fiction that leeches simply appear when needed, like bread from a bakery or horseshoes from a blacksmith. The physicians who buy your leeches treat you with the same casual indifference they might show to a piece of furniture. You're useful, but you're not a person in any meaningful sense. They don't ask about your health, your family, or your working conditions. They don't express gratitude for the risks you take or the suffering you endure to provide them with the tools of their trade. They examine your leeches with more care and attention than they give to you, checking each specimen for size, activity level, and overall condition, while barely glancing at the person who risked life and limb to capture them. Payment for your services is always a negotiation, and it's a negotiation in which you have no leverage whatsoever. The physicians know that you have no other customers, no alternative markets, no way to store your product for extended periods. Leeches are perishable goods that have to be sold quickly or they become worthless. This gives the buyers enormous power to dictate terms, and they use this power ruthlessly. They'll offer you barely enough to survive, knowing that you have no choice but to accept whatever they're willing to pay. The payment itself is often in goods rather than coin, and the goods are usually whatever the physician wants to get rid of rather than anything you actually need. Stale bread, spoiled meat, worn-out clothing, broken tools. You're expected to be grateful for these cast-offs, to treat them as generous gifts rather than the barely adequate compensation they actually are. Complaining about the quality or quantity of payment is not an option because complaining customers can easily be replaced by hungrier, more desperate ones. The other villagers view you with a mixture of disgust, fear, and grudging necessity. They need the medical services that your leeches make possible, but they don't want to be reminded of how those services are provided. You smell like the marshes. You look like someone who spends their days being fed upon by parasites, and you carry with you the aura of disease and death that clings to anyone who works in the wetlands. Children are warned to stay away from you, not because you're dangerous, but because you represent something unclean, something that might contaminate them through proximity. Social interactions with normal villagers are brief, awkward, and usually conducted at a distance. When you enter the village to sell your leeches or buy supplies, people step aside to let you pass, not out of respect, but out of revulsion. Shopkeepers serve you quickly and efficiently, eager to complete the transaction and get you out of their establishments before your presence drives away other customers. Conversations are limited to the bare minimum necessary to conduct business, and eye contact is avoided whenever possible. The church, which in medieval society serves as both spiritual center and social hub, treats you as a necessary evil rather than a valued member of the community. You're allowed to attend services, but you're expected to sit in the back, away from the respectable families who form the core of the congregation. The priest acknowledges your existence but doesn't encourage your participation in church activities or community events. Your profession is seen as somehow spiritually contaminating, as if working with blood-sucking creatures has marked you as unclean in the eyes of God. Marriage and family life are complicated by your social status and professional requirements. Few people want to marry someone who smells like a swamp and whose income depends on being regularly fed upon by parasites. The women who might consider you as a husband are usually in equally desperate circumstances, widows with no other options, women with physical or mental disabilities that make them unmarriageable by normal standards, or other social outcasts who have no choice but to settle for whatever companionship they can find. If you do manage to find someone willing to share your life, the relationship is shaped by the harsh realities of your profession. Your wife, if she's practical, will learn to assist with your work, helping to maintain equipment, care for captured leeches, and treat your injuries. Your children, if you have any, will be raised in the same environment of poverty and desperation that shaped your own childhood. They'll learn the family trade not because they choose to, but because they have no other options for survival. The cycle of poverty and social exclusion that defines your life is self-perpetuating and nearly impossible to break. Your children will grow up marked by the same stigma that marks you. They'll be excluded from the same social opportunities, denied the same chances for advancement, trapped in the same narrow range of survival options. The skills and knowledge that you pass down to them are valuable within the context of leech catching, but they're useless for any other profession. You're not just training them to follow in your footsteps. You're ensuring that they have no choice but to follow in your footsteps. Education, in any formal sense, is not available to your family. Schools, such as they exist in medieval society, are for the children of merchants, craftsmen, and minor nobility. Your children learn what they need to know to survive, but they don't learn to read, write, or calculate beyond the basic arithmetic necessary for conducting simple business transactions. This lack of education further limits their options and ensures that they remain trapped in the same social stratum that has imprisoned your family for generations. Legal protection is minimal and often non-existent. If someone cheats you in a business transaction, you have little recourse. If someone injures you or damages your property, you're unlikely to receive compensation. If someone accuses you of a crime, you're unlikely to receive a fair hearing. Your word carries no weight against that of a respectable citizen, and your testimony is automatically suspect because of your social status and profession. The legal system, such as it is, views you as inherently untrustworthy. Your profession requires you to work in isolated areas where crimes could easily be committed without witnesses. Your appearance and smell mark you as someone who exists outside the boundaries of normal society. Your poverty makes you desperate enough to consider illegal activities as survival strategies. All of these factors combine to make you a convenient scapegoat when crimes are committed and a suspect is needed. Economic mobility is virtually impossible. You can't save money because you barely earn enough to survive. You can't invest in better equipment because you don't have capital to invest. You can't expand your business because the market for leeches is limited and already saturated. You can't change professions because you don't have the skills, connections, or resources necessary to learn a new trade. You're trapped in an economic system that keeps you alive but never allows you to improve your circumstances. The irony of your situation is that your work is genuinely important. Medieval medicine depends on bloodletting, and bloodletting depends on leeches, and leeches depend on people like you who are willing to risk their lives to harvest them. Without your services, physicians couldn't treat their patients, the medical system would collapse, and people would die from conditions that could otherwise be treated. You're an essential part of the healthcare infrastructure, but you're treated as if you're completely expendable. This contradiction between your importance and your treatment creates a psychological burden that's almost as difficult to bear as the physical hardships of your profession. You know that your work matters, that people depend on the services you provide, that the community would suffer without your contributions. But you also know that no one acknowledges this importance, no one appreciates your sacrifices, and no one cares whether you live or die as long as someone else is available to take your place. The social isolation that comes with your profession is perhaps its most devastating aspect. Humans are social creatures who need connection, community, and belonging to maintain their mental health and emotional well-being. Your profession cuts you off from normal social interactions and marks you as someone who doesn't quite belong in human society. You exist on the margins, tolerated but not accepted, needed but not wanted, essential but invisible. In the end, your place in society is defined not by what you contribute, but by what you represent, the dark, unpleasant realities that civilized people prefer not to think about. You're a reminder that someone has to do the dirty work, someone has to take the risks, someone has to make the sacrifices that allow others to live comfortable, clean, respectable lives. And because people don't want to be reminded of these uncomfortable truths, they prefer to keep you at a distance, to treat you as something less than fully human, to pretend that you don't really exist, except when your services are absolutely necessary. The business side, running a leech catching operation, is like trying to manage a business where your product is alive, your workplace is actively trying to kill you, your customers hold all the power, and your profit margins are measured in survival rather than success. You're not really an entrepreneur in any meaningful sense. You're more like a desperate person who has found a way to monetize their own suffering and is hoping to extract just enough value from the process to avoid starvation. The economics of leech catching operate on principles that would baffle any reasonable business person. Your overhead costs are minimal but essential: basic tools, containers, and whatever medical supplies you can afford to treat your inevitable injuries. Your labor costs are literally paid in blood, as you are simultaneously the workforce, the production facility, and the raw material source. Your inventory is alive and requires constant care, feeding, and proper environmental conditions to remain viable. Your customer base consists primarily of physicians, monastery infirmaries, and the occasional wealthy household that keeps medical supplies on hand for emergencies. These are not customers in the modern sense of people who shop around for the best deals and service. They're more like feudal lords who expect tribute, and you're the peasant who provides it. They know you need them more than they need you, and they structure every interaction to remind you of this fundamental power imbalance. The physicians are your primary market, but they're also your primary source of frustration. They want leeches that are large, active, and healthy, but they want to pay prices that barely cover your costs of harvesting them. They want consistent quality and reliable delivery, but they don't want to pay enough to make quality control and reliability economically feasible. They want you to be available whenever they need leeches, but they don't want to commit to regular orders that would allow you to plan your work and income. Negotiating with physicians is an exercise in controlled desperation. You have to appear confident and professional while knowing that you're completely at their mercy. You have to advocate for fair prices while being careful not to seem too demanding or difficult to work with. You have to demonstrate the quality of your product while downplaying the risks and hardships involved in producing it, because customers don't want to pay extra for your suffering. The pricing structure for leeches is based on factors that are largely beyond your control. Size matters. Larger leeches command higher prices because they can draw more blood more efficiently. Activity level matters. Lively, aggressive leeches are preferred over sluggish ones. Health matters. Leeches that show signs of disease or injury are worthless. But all of these factors depend on environmental conditions, seasonal variations, and pure luck, none of which you can influence through better business practices or increased effort. Quality control in the leech business is a constant challenge because your product is alive and can die, escape, or become contaminated at any point between capture and sale. You have to maintain proper water temperature, adequate food supply, and appropriate spacing in your storage containers. You have to monitor each leech for signs of illness or injury and remove any specimens that might contaminate the others. You have to transport them carefully to prevent damage during the journey to market. The storage and transportation of live leeches requires equipment and expertise that you've had to develop through trial and error, because there are no textbooks or training programs for professional leech catchers. You've learned that certain types of containers work better than others, that specific water temperatures keep leeches healthy longer, and that particular feeding schedules maximize their survival rates. This knowledge has been acquired through years of expensive mistakes and lost inventory. Seasonal fluctuations in demand create additional business challenges. Spring and summer, when people are more active and more likely to injure themselves, tend to be high-demand periods for medical leeches. Fall and winter, when people stay indoors and physicians see fewer patients, tend to be slower periods. But these seasonal patterns don't necessarily align with the seasonal patterns of leech availability, which depend on water temperature, breeding cycles, and environmental conditions. The most frustrating aspect of the leech business is that increased effort doesn't necessarily lead to increased income. You can work longer hours, venture into more dangerous areas, and take greater risks without any guarantee that you'll capture more or better leeches. The productivity of your work depends on factors that are completely outside your control. Weather, water conditions, leech population cycles, and pure chance. You can do everything right and still have a terrible day, or you can make mistakes and still get lucky. Competition in the leech catching business comes from other desperate people who are willing to work for even less money than you are. There's always someone hungrier, more desperate, or more willing to take dangerous risks to undercut your prices. This creates a race to the bottom where everyone involved is trying to survive by accepting less and less compensation for increasingly dangerous and difficult work. The seasonal nature of leech catching means that you have to find alternative sources of income during the months when the marshes are frozen or when leech activity is too low to make harvesting profitable. These alternative income sources are usually even less pleasant than leech catching. Cleaning out stables, disposing of dead animals, or performing other tasks that no one else wants to do. The skills you've developed as a leech catcher don't transfer well to other professions, so your options are limited to the most undesirable jobs available. Cash flow is a constant problem because your income is irregular and unpredictable, while your expenses are constant and unavoidable. You need food, shelter, and equipment, regardless of whether you've had a good day or a bad day in the marshes. You can't save money during good periods because there aren't enough good periods to create a surplus. You can't borrow money during bad periods because you have no collateral and no reliable income to guarantee repayment. The lack of written contracts or formal business agreements means that you're constantly vulnerable to being cheated by customers who decide not to pay less than agreed, or pay with goods that are worth less than promised. You have no legal recourse when this happens because your word carries no weight against that of a respectable physician or merchant. You have to accept whatever payment is offered and hope that future transactions will be more favourable. Despite all these challenges, you persist in treating leech catching as a business rather than simply a form of slow suicide, because maintaining the illusion of entrepreneurship helps preserve some small measure of dignity and self-respect. You're not just a victim of circumstances, you're a business owner, a professional, someone who provides valuable services to the community. This self-image may be largely fictional, but it's one of the few things that makes your life bearable, and you cling to it with the same desperation that you cling to life itself. There's a particular kind of despair that comes from realizing that your life has no arc, no progression, no development toward anything better. Other people have stories. They're born, they learn, they grow, they achieve things, they build something, they leave something behind. Your life is not a story, it's a loop, an endless repetition of the same basic survival activities that will continue until your body gives out or the marshes finally claim you. You wake up, you wade into the swamp, you let leeches feed on your blood, you sell them for barely enough to survive, and then you do it all again the next day. The realization that this is not a temporary situation, not a difficult period that you will eventually overcome. but rather the permanent structure of your existence settles into your consciousness like sediment settling to the bottom of a stagnant pond. It doesn't happen all at once. It accumulates gradually, day by day, year by year, until one morning you wake up and understand with perfect clarity that this is your life. This has always been your life, and this will always be your life until it ends. The seasonal cycle that governs your work creates an illusion of change and progression, but it's really just the same pattern repeated endlessly. Spring brings the return of active leeches and the hope that this year might be different, that conditions might be better, that you might somehow find a way to improve your circumstances. Summer brings the peak working season and the temporary prosperity that comes from high demand and good weather. Autumn brings the gradual decline in leech activity and the growing anxiety about surviving the winter. Winter brings the shutdown of work and the desperate struggle to survive on whatever resources you've managed to accumulate. But each cycle brings you back to exactly the same place where you started, only older, more damaged, and less capable of handling the physical demands of the work. The seasonal progression that seems to promise change and renewal actually delivers only repetition and decline. You're not moving forward through time. You're moving in circles, wearing a deeper and deeper groove in the same small patch of existence. Your children, if you have them, represent both your greatest hope and your greatest failure. You hope that somehow they'll find a way to escape the cycle that has trapped you, that they'll discover opportunities that were never available to you, that they'll build better lives than the one you've been able to provide for them. But you also know, with the certainty that comes from bitter experience, that they're almost certainly doomed to follow the same path that you followed. The skills you teach them are the skills of survival in the marshes, how to identify good leech habitats, how to move safely through dangerous terrain, how to treat injuries with available materials, how to endure discomfort and pain without complaint. These are valuable skills within the narrow context of leech catching, but they're useless for any other profession. By teaching them what they need to know to survive, you're also ensuring that survival in the marshes becomes their only option. The economic realities that trapped you in this profession are the same economic realities that will trap your children. They don't have access to education, capital, or social connections that would allow them to pursue other careers. They don't have the luxury of taking risks on uncertain opportunities because failure means starvation. They don't have the time or energy to develop new skills because all their time and energy is consumed by the immediate demands of survival. The most tragic aspect of this generational cycle is that each generation understands exactly what's happening, but is powerless to change it. You know that you're condemning your children to the same life of suffering and limitation that you've endured, but you also know that you have no alternative to offer them. Teaching them the family trade is the only way to ensure their survival, even though it's also the only way to ensure their entrapment. The cycle extends beyond individual families to encompass entire communities of people who are trapped in the same economic and social circumstances. The village where you live exists primarily to support the leech catching industry, and everyone who lives there is either directly involved in the trade or dependent on it for their livelihood. The children who grow up in this environment have no exposure to other ways of life, no models of different possibilities, no reason to believe that anything else is possible. The broader economic system that creates demand for leeches and maintains the market for your services is also a system that ensures your continued poverty and dependence. The physicians who buy your leeches have no incentive to pay you more than the minimum necessary for survival because they know that desperation will always provide them with a steady supply of people willing to do this work for almost nothing. The most devastating realization is that the cycle is not just endless, but also pointless. You're not building anything. creating anything, or contributing to any kind of progress or improvement. You're simply maintaining a system that keeps you alive while slowly destroying you, and you're training your children to maintain the same system that will keep them alive while slowly destroying them. The work continues, the suffering continues, and nothing ever gets better. In the end, the endless cycle of leech catching becomes a metaphor for the broader human condition under systems of oppression and exploitation. People become trapped in patterns of survival that prevent them from living, in cycles of work that prevent them from growing, in structures of necessity that prevent them from choosing. They pass these patterns down to their children, not because they want to, but because they have no choice. And the cycle continues, generation after generation, until something external breaks it, or everyone involved dies trying to maintain it. And so we come to the end of our journey into the murky waters of medieval leech catching, a profession that existed in the shadows of history, practiced by people whose names were never recorded, whose contributions were never celebrated, and whose suffering was never acknowledged by the societies they served. As you lie there in your comfortable bed, perhaps with the gentle hum of modern conveniences in the background, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit and the terrible price that survival sometimes demands. The leech catchers of medieval times were not heroes in any conventional sense. They didn't perform great deeds, led armies, or changed the course of history. They simply endured, day after day, year after year, generation after generation, finding ways to extract just enough value from their own suffering to justify continuing to exist. They were ordinary people trapped in extraordinary circumstances, doing whatever was necessary to survive in a world that offered them no alternatives and no hope of improvement. Their story is not a comfortable one, and it's not meant to be. It's a reminder that the comfortable, clean, safe lives that many of us enjoy today were built on the backs of countless people who lived and died in conditions that we can barely imagine. The medical advances that we take for granted were made possible, in part, by people who risked their lives to provide the tools and materials that physicians needed to practice their craft, however primitive and misguided that craft might seem to us now. The leech catchers also represent something profound about human adaptability and the will to survive. They found ways to live and work in environments that should have killed them. They developed skills and knowledge that allowed them to extract resources from places where most people saw only danger and death. They created meaning and purpose in lives that seemed to offer neither. They maintained families and communities under conditions that would have destroyed most social bonds. But perhaps most importantly, they remind us that survival is not the same as living, that endurance is not the same as fulfillment, and that the ability to adapt to terrible circumstances is both a testament to human strength and a tragedy of human potential. The leech catchers survived, but they were never allowed to thrive. They adapted, but they were never allowed to grow. They endured, but they were never allowed to hope. Their profession eventually disappeared, not because conditions improved for the people who practiced it, but because medical science moved beyond the need for bloodletting and the leeches that made it possible. The demand for their services simply evaporated, leaving them to find other ways to survive or to die quietly in the same marshes where they had spent their working lives. There were no pensions, no retraining programs, no social safety nets to ease their transition to other forms of work. They were simply abandoned by a society that had used them up and no longer needed them. The marshes where they worked have mostly been drained or developed, transformed into farmland, housing developments, or industrial sites. The knowledge they accumulated about wetland ecology and leech behavior has been largely lost, replaced by scientific understanding that is more accurate, but perhaps less intimate. The skills they developed for surviving in hostile environments have become obsolete, relevant only to historians and anthropologists who study the ways that people lived in the distant past. But their legacy lives on in the countless other people who continue to do the dangerous, dirty, essential work that keeps our societies functioning. The people who clean up after disasters, who handle toxic waste, who work in dangerous conditions for minimal pay, who risk their health and safety to provide services that the rest of us prefer not to think about. The specific profession of leech catching may be extinct, but the social and economic forces that created it are still very much alive. The story of the medieval leech catcher is ultimately a story about the cost of survival in systems that value some lives more than others, that treat some people as expendable resources rather than as human beings with inherent worth and dignity. It's a story about the ways that poverty and desperation can trap people in cycles of suffering that persist across generations. It's a story about the incredible things that people will do to stay alive, and the terrible price they sometimes pay for the privilege of existence. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll spare a thought for those forgotten souls who spent their days in the marshes, who let leeches feed on their blood so that physicians could treat their patients, who sacrificed their health and their futures so that medieval medicine could function, however imperfectly. They were not saints or heroes, but they were human beings who deserved better than the lives they were forced to live. Their story reminds us to be grateful for the opportunities we have, the choices we can make, and the safety nets that protect us from the kind of desperate circumstances that once forced people to make their living in the swamps. It reminds us to think about the hidden costs of the systems we depend on and the people who pay those costs on our behalf. It reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that comfort is not guaranteed, and that the distance between civilization and desperation is often smaller than we like to believe. The medieval leech catchers are gone now, their suffering ended, their struggles concluded. They rest in unmarked graves or in the depths of the marshes where they worked, their stories largely untold, their contributions largely unremembered. But in telling their story, we honor their memory and acknowledge their humanity. We recognize that they were more than just footnotes in the history of medicine, more than just anonymous figures in the background of medieval life. They were people who loved and were loved, who hoped and despaired, who struggled and endured, who found ways to maintain their dignity and humanity even under the most dehumanizing circumstances. They were our ancestors, in spirit if not in blood, and their story is part of our story, their struggle part of our heritage, their resilience part of our inheritance. So sleep well tonight, knowing that you are the beneficiary of countless sacrifices made by countless people whose names you will never know. Sleep peacefully, understanding that the comfort and safety you enjoy were purchased with the suffering and endurance of those who came before you. Sleep deeply, remembering that every generation builds on the foundations laid by previous generations, and that those foundations were often built by people who had no choice but to work in the marshes, letting leeches feed on their blood, so that life could continue and progress could be made. The story of the medieval leech catcher is over, but the human story continues. May we learn from their example, honor their memory, and work to create a world where no one has to choose between dignity and survival, where no one has to sacrifice their humanity for the privilege of existence, where no one has to spend their life in the marshes unless they choose to be there. Good night. and thank you for joining me on this journey into the forgotten corners of human experience. Until next time, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember that every story matters, every life has value, and every person deserves to be remembered.